The Texas sun dipped below the horizon of the ranch porch at sunset, painting the vast sky in bruised shades of purple and burnt orange, while the wind chimes sang a lonely melody against the wooden beams. It was the kind of silence that usually brought peace to a man's soul, but tonight that silence was miles away, replaced by the sterile hum of a vending machine in the hallway of the Dusty Creek County Memorial Hospital. The automatic doors slid open with a grinding noise that sounded like a cough, admitting a gust of freezing wind, and two figures into the fluorescent glare of the lobby. George Strait stomped his boots on the rubber mat, shaking off the remnants of a rare West Texas snowfall, while Norma adjusted her scarf around her neck. To the sleepy receptionist behind the glass partition, they were just another older couple coming in from the cold, likely visiting a sick relative on Christmas Eve. George pulled the brim of his black Stetson down slightly, not out of arrogance, but out of a habit born from decades of flashing cameras. Here in this crumbling brick building on the edge of town, he was not the king of country music. He was just George, a man who knew that pain and sickness did not care about platinum records or sold-out rodeos. The hospital smelled of floor wax and old coffee, a scent that stuck to the back of the throat. The holiday decorations were sparse, a few strings of tinsel taped haphazardly to the nurse's station, and a plastic tree that looked like it had survived too many winters in a damp basement. George adjusted the collar of his canvas jacket, feeling the weight of the small gifts in his pockets. They had been doing this for years, quietly slipping into places that the big city charities forgot, bringing a little dignity to those facing the holidays in a hospital bed. They moved toward the geriatric wing where the air was heavier and the shadows stretched longer. The linoleum floor was scuffed, marked by the passage of countless gurneys and wheelchairs. As they walked, George listened to the rhythm of the place. It was a sad song, a ballad of slow heartbeats and shallow breaths. He squeezed Norma's hand, and she squeezed back a silent communication that they had built over 50 years of marriage. They did not need words to understand the gravity of the night. Up ahead, near room 304, the quiet was shattered by a voice that was too loud, too sharp, and entirely devoid of compassion. George slowed his pace, his boots moving silently now on the polished floor. He saw a man in a suit that cost more than most of the trucks in the parking lot, standing over a weary-looking nurse. The man was holding a clipboard, like a weapon, tapping it against his palm with an impatient rhythm. This was Mr. Vance, the new hospital administrator, a man sent from Dallas to trim the fat and balance the books of a rural healthcare system that was bleeding money. Vance was a man of spreadsheets, not heartbeats. His hair was gelled back tight, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine that looked out of place amidst the dust and grime of Dusty Creek. The nurse, a woman named Sarah, who had likely delivered half the babies in the county, looked close to tears, but her jaw was set in defiance. George stopped a few feet away, lingering in the shadow of a linen cart, listening. Vance's voice carried the nasal tone of bureaucratic authority. He was saying that the patient in 304 was a drain on resources. He was saying that the state facility in Lubbock had a bed open and that the transfer needed to happen immediately. He was talking about a human being as if he were discussing a piece of broken equipment that needed to be sent to the scrapyard. Sarah argued back, her voice trembling, but firm, stating that a transfer in this weather would kill him and that it was Christmas Eve. She pleaded for just 2 more days, just enough time to let the storm pass and let the man have some peace. Vance laughed, a dry, soundless exhale that chilled George more than the wind outside. He told her that sentimentality did not pay the electric bill. He told her that if she wanted to run a charity, she should open a church, but as long as she was on his payroll, she would follow protocol. He looked at his watch, checking the time as if he had a dinner reservation he was anxious to keep. George felt a heat rise in his chest that had nothing to do with the hospital heating system. It was the old protective instinct, the code of the cowboy that said, "You look out for the weak and you stand up to the bullies." He stepped out of the shadows, his movement slow and deliberate. Norma stayed a step behind him, watching him with eyes that knew exactly what was about to happen. When George spoke, his voice was low, a deep baritone that rumbled like distant thunder. He asked simply if there was a problem. Vance spun around, clearly annoyed at the interruption. He looked George up and down, taking in the worn jacket, the jeans that had seen actual work, and the boots that were scuffed at the toes. To Vance, George was just another local rancher, another relic of a dying way of life. He did not see the eyes that had stared down millions of fans. He did not see the man who had redefined a genre. He just saw an obstacle. Vance sneered, adjusting his silk tie. He told George that this was a private administrative matter and that visiting hours were technically over for non-family members. He waved his hand dismissively, a gesture meant to shoo away a fly. He turned back to Sarah, ignoring George, completely ready to issue his final order for the eviction of the patient in room 304. But George did not move. He stood his ground, his feet planted wide, his thumbs hooked into his belt loops. He asked again politely, but with an edge that could cut glass, who exactly was in room 304 and why he was being moved in a blizzard. Vance sighed, turning back with exaggerated patience. He explained that the patient was Elias Thorne, a man with no insurance, no next of kin, and no assets. He explained that Mr. Thorne had overstayed his welcome and that the hospital was not a homeless shelter. He used words like liability and fiscal responsibility, words that tasted like ash in the air of the holy night. The name struck George like a physical blow. Elias Thorne. The name echoed in the canyons of his memory, bouncing off the walls of his childhood. He searched the archives of his mind, trying to place it. He knew the name, but it was from a time before the fame, before the music, from a time of dust and drought. He looked at the door of room 304, the number peeling slightly off the wood. Behind that door lay a man who was being discarded because his bank account was empty. Vance mistook George's silence for submission. He stepped closer, invading George's personal space, a smirk playing on his lips. He told George to take his wife and his hat and go back to whatever farm they came from. He said that the real world required tough decisions and that cowboys didn't understand the complexities of modern healthcare management. He reached out to tap George on the shoulder, a patronizing gesture meant to guide him toward the exit. George didn't flinch. He just looked at Vance's hand and then up into his eyes. The look was calm, terrifyingly calm. It was the look of a man who had roped bulls that weighed a ton and stood in the center of storms without blinking. He told Vance that he wasn't going anywhere until he saw Elias Thorne. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He just stated it as a fact, as immutable as the sunrise. Vance blinked, surprised by the resistance. He signaled to a security guard down the hall, a young man who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. The tension in the hallway thickened. The beep of the heart monitors seemed to speed up, syncing with the rising pulse of the confrontation. Sarah, the nurse, looked from Vance to George, hope flickering in her eyes. She didn't know who this stranger was, but she saw the steel in his spine. George stepped around Vance, moving toward the door of room 304. Vance shouted that he was trespassing, that he would have him arrested. George ignored him, his hand reaching for the metal handle of the door. He turned the knob and pushed it open. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of the medical equipment and the streetlights outside filtering through the blinds. The air inside was colder than the hallway. In the bed lay a figure that looked more like a skeleton draped in paper-thin skin than a man. Elias Thorne was asleep, his breathing ragged and shallow. He looked ancient, weathered like an old fence post that had stood against the wind for a century. His hands resting on the thin blanket were gnarled and scarred, the hands of a man who had worked the earth until the earth took everything back. George walked to the bedside, removing his hat and holding it against his chest. Norma followed quietly, closing the door behind them, muffling Vance's angry shouts in the corridor. George looked down at the old man. He saw the lines on his face, the map of a hard life. And then he saw it. On the bedside table, amidst the clutter of medicine cups and tissues, sat an old wooden cigar box. It was battered and scratched, the lid held on by a single hinge. It was just a box to anyone else, but to a man who grew up on the land, to a man who knew the history of the soil under his boots, that box looked like a time capsule. George felt a strange pull, a magnetic force, drawing him to the dying man. He didn't know why yet, but he knew that his presence here tonight was not an accident. It was not just a random act of charity. It was destiny calling in a debt. Outside the door, the muffled sounds of Vance arguing with the security guard grew louder. He was demanding keys, demanding police, demanding order. But inside the room, time seemed to suspend. The wind howled against the window pane, rattling the glass, trying to get in. George reached out and gently touched the old man's shoulder. The skin was cool to the touch. Elias stirred. His eyelids fluttered, struggling against the weight of exhaustion and medication. He opened his eyes. They were milky with age and cataracts, but for a fleeting second, there was a spark of clarity. He looked at George. He didn't see the superstar. He squinted, trying to focus in the dim light. His lips moved dry and cracked. He whispered a name, not George's name. He whispered, John. George froze. John was his father. John Straight had been gone for years, buried in the Texas soil he loved. How did this man, this forgotten indigent patient, know his father? The mystery deepened, wrapping around George's heart like a vine. Elias coughed a wet, rattling sound that shook his frail body. He tried to speak again, his hand trembling as he pointed a shaking finger toward the bedside table, toward the cigar box. The box! Elias wheezed, his voice barely audible over the hum of the oxygen machine. Give to John's boy. George felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the drafty window. He looked at Norma and saw the same shock reflected in her eyes. This was not a random encounter. This was a convergence of past and present. George reached for the box, his hand hovering over the worn wood. He could hear the heavy footsteps of Vance approaching the door again, the click of the lock being engaged by a key from the outside. The administration was coming to throw them out, to throw Elias out into the snow. But George Straight was already holding the box, and whatever was inside was about to change the trajectory of the night and the history of his family forever. The door handle jiggled violently. Vance was shouting now, threatening lawsuits. George didn't care. He opened the lid of the cigar box. The smell of cedar and old tobacco wafted up, mixed with the scent of decaying paper. Inside lay the secrets of a lifetime waiting to be read. The smell of cedar and dried tobacco leaves that rose from the open cigar box was a sensory time machine, instantly transporting George Straight from the sterile cold of room 304 back to the dusty tack rooms and sun-bleached porches of his youth. The shouting on the other side of the door became a distant, muffled roar, like the sound of a storm you know is coming, but hasn't yet broken the levee. For now the world had shrunk down to the trembling hands of a country music legend and the yellowed, fragile contents of a box that held a stranger's soul. George's fingers, thick and calloused from years of gripping guitar necks and horse reins, carefully lifted the first item. It was a photograph, black and white, its edges curled and cracked like dried mud. Two young men stood leaning against a 1950s Ford pickup truck, their hats pushed back on their heads, smiles wide and reckless, in the way only young men who haven't yet been broken by life can smile. On the left was a face George knew better than his own, the sharp jawline, the deep-set eyes of his father, John Straight. But on the right, with an arm draped casually over John's shoulder, was a young Elias Thorne. He looked nothing like the withered husk in the hospital bed. In the photo, he was vibrant, a bull of a man, with shoulders that looked like they could carry the world. Beneath the photo lay a document folded in thirds, the paper heavy and formal. It was a property deed, dated October 14th, 1955. George squinted, reading the typewriter ink that had faded to a ghostly grey. It was a bill of sale, but the details made George's breath hitch in his throat. It detailed the sale of 600 acres of prime river-bottom land, land that George knew well, land that was currently part of the Straight family holdings. But the seller was Elias Thorne. The buyer was a holding company that George recognized as a predatory lender from the old days, the kind that circled like vultures when the rains stopped falling. Attached to the deed was a handwritten note, penned in the looping, careful cursive of a man who respected the power of the written word. George read it silently, his lips moving slightly. John, the drought is going to take us all if we don't do something. I sold the river parcels today. It's enough to clear the lien on your place and keep the bank off your back for another 5 years. Don't you argue with me. You have a boy to raise. I'm just a bachelor with no one to answer to but the Lord. Keep your land. I'll keep the rocky patch up on the ridge. It's enough for me. Just promise me you won't tell the boy until he's old enough to understand what neighbors do for neighbors. The silence in the room was sudden and absolute. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. George felt the floor shift beneath him, not physically, but existentially. The empire he had built, the ranch where he raised his own son, the sanctuary where he retreated when the lights of the stage became too blinding. All of it existed because this dying man in a charity ward had sold his own future to save George's father. Elias hadn't just loaned money, he had amputated his own prosperity to save a friend. He had taken the rocky scrubland, the land that couldn't grow decent hay, just so the Straight family could keep the fertile soil. George looked up from the paper, his eyes burning. He looked at Elias. The old man was watching him, a faint ghost of a smile playing on his blue lips. It wasn't a smile of pride or expectation. It was the smile of a man who had kept a secret for 60 years and was finally unburdening himself before the end. "You knew," George whispered, his voice cracking. "All this time, you were the one. Dad always said an angel investor stepped in during the big dry. He never said it was you. He never said you gave up everything." Elias coughed a sound that rattled deep in his fluid-filled lungs. He reached out a trembling hand, and George took it, immediately gripping the dry, papery skin with both of his warm, strong hands. "Your daddy," Elias wheezed each word, a struggle, "was a proud man. Too proud to take charity. I had to make it look like business. But it wasn't business. It was family, not by blood, but by the dirt. We were brothers in the dirt." Norma, who had been reading over George's shoulder, wiped a tear from her cheek. She understood the magnitude of this. In the cowboy culture, land is everything. To give up your land for another man is the ultimate sacrifice. It is greater than giving money. It is giving up your legacy. "Why didn't you come to me?" George asked the question, agonizing. "When I made it, when the records started selling, I could have bought you 10 ranches. I could have fixed this." Elias shook his head slowly against the pillow. "That wasn't the deal, George. A gift with a price tag ain't a gift, it's a loan. I didn't want a loan. I wanted to see John's boy do good, and you did good, son." I listened. Every song, every rodeo. I sat on my porch on that rocky ridge and I listened to the radio and I said, "That's my part of the story. That music. That's the harvest I never got to plant." The purity of the sentiment hit George like a physical blow. In a world of contracts, agents' percentages and lawyers here, was a man who operated on a currency that had long gone out of circulation, pure, unadulterated honor. George felt a wave of shame wash over him. While he was flying in private jets, Elias was likely struggling to keep the heat on in a trailer on a rocky ridge. And now here he was, alone, dying in a place that treated him like expired inventory. The moment of reverence was shattered. The lock on the door clicked sharply and the handle turned. The door swung open with violence, hitting the wall with a loud bang. Mr. Vance stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 security guards and a breathless, terrified Sarah. Vance's face was red, his composure cracking under the strain of being disobeyed. The fluorescent light from the hallway spilled into the room, harsh and blinding, cutting through the intimate atmosphere like a knife. "That is enough," Vance barked, stepping into the room. He pointed a manicured finger at George. "I don't care who you think you are. You are disrupting a medical facility. You are trespassing, and you—" He turned his glare onto the bed, onto Elias. "You are officially discharged. The transport van is 5 minutes away. Get him up." He gestured to the guards. They were big men locals, probably just trying to pay their bills, but they looked hesitant. They recognized George now. It was hard not to. The face that had graced 1,000 magazine covers was unmistakable, even in the dim light. But Vance was their boss, and the fear of unemployment in a small town is a powerful motivator. They took a step toward the bed. George didn't shout. He didn't throw a punch. He did something far more intimidating. He carefully placed the cigar box on the bedside table. He placed the deed on top of it, smoothing the crease with his thumb. Then he turned slowly to face Vance. He stood up to his full height. George Strait is not a giant man physically, but in that moment he seemed to fill the room, blocking the path to Elias like a granite boulder blocking a canyon pass. "You touch him," George said, his voice dropping to a register that was barely a whisper, but carried the weight of a judge's gavel, "and you will regret it for the rest of your life. Not because I'm famous, but because what you are doing is a sin against everything this town stands for." Vance scoffed, nervously adjusting his tie. "Save the sermon for Sunday, cowboy. This is a business. This man is a liability. He has consumed $40,000 in resources with 0 reimbursement. I have a board of directors to answer to. I have a budget. If you care so much, take him with you. Put him in your truck, but he is leaving this bed right now." Vance moved to grab the rail of the bed, intending to unlock the wheels. It was a physical violation, a crossing of the line. George's hand shot out, grabbing Vance's wrist. It wasn't a violent squeeze, but it was ironclad. Vance froze, looking down at the hand restraining him, then up at George's eyes. The eyes were hard, cold flint. "He isn't a liability," George said through gritted teeth. "He is the reason I'm standing here. He is the reason half this county didn't go under in '55. You're not just kicking out an old man, you're kicking out a hero." "He's a squatter," Vance spat, trying to yank his wrist free but failing. "And you are assaulting a hospital administrator. Officers, remove him. Now!" The guards shuffled forward nervously. "Mr. Straight," one of them said apologetically, "Sir, please don't make us do this. Mr. Vance he's the boss." George released Vance's wrist with a shove that sent the administrator stumbling back a step. George looked at the guards, then at Sarah, who was weeping silently in the doorway. He realized that physical force wouldn't win this. Vance had the law, the cold, bureaucratic letter of the law, on his side. If George fought them, they would arrest him, and while he sat in a cell, Elias would be thrown into a van and shipped off to die alone on a highway. George needed a different kind of weapon. He needed to turn the lights on. He needed to drag this dark, shameful little room into the spotlight of the world. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone. It was a modern incongruity in his cowboy hands. He looked at Norma. She nodded, understanding his plan instantly. She moved to the side of the bed, taking Elias's hand again, shielding him protectively. "You want to talk about budgets, Mr. Vance?" George said, tapping the screen. "You want to talk about the bottom line? Let's talk about it. But let's not keep it a secret. If you're so proud of your policy, let's explain it to the folks who buy the tickets and pay the taxes." Vance looked confused. "What are you doing?" "I'm going live," George said simply. "I have about, I don't know, a few million followers who might be interested to see how Dusty Creek Memorial treats its elders on Christmas Eve." Vance's face drained of color. The arrogance evaporated instantly, replaced by the sheer panic of a cockroach when the kitchen light is flipped on. "You can't do that. There are privacy laws, HIPAA regulations." "I'm not filming the other patients," George said, holding the phone up the camera lens facing himself. "I'm filming me, and I'm filming you, and I'm going to tell them a story about a man named Elias Thorne, and I'm going to ask them what they think about a hospital administrator who throws a dying man into a blizzard to save a few bucks." George pressed the button. The screen flashed. The live icon appeared in the corner. The counter started ticking. 100 viewers, 5,000 viewers, 20,000 viewers. The numbers skyrocketed instantly. The world was tuning in. "Merry Christmas, everyone," George said to the camera, his voice shifting into that familiar warm tone that millions recognized, but with an undercurrent of steel. "I'm here at Dusty Creek Memorial, and I need your help. I'm standing here with a friend of my father's, a man who saved my family. And this gentleman here," he panned the camera to a horrified Vance who tried to duck away. "Mr. Vance tells me there's no room at the inn." The room was silent, except for the beep of the monitor and the rising wind outside. But the digital world was exploding. Comments were flying up the screen faster than the eye could read. Anger, shock, offers of help, threats against the hospital administration. Vance stood paralyzed. He knew his career was hanging by a thread. He looked at the guards, but they had stepped back, unwilling to be part of the viral moment that would ruin them. George turned the camera back to Elias, who looked bewildered by the technology but comforted by George's presence. "This man," George continued, addressing the millions, "gave up his land so I could have mine. He's the definition of a Texas hero, and tonight we're going to make sure he knows he isn't forgotten." George lowered the phone slightly, looking directly at Vance, not through the screen but eye to eye. "So here is the deal, Vance. You have two choices. You can walk out that door, get in your fancy car, and drive back to Dallas or wherever you came from and never come back. Or you can stay here and explain to these 300,000 people watching right now why you think Elias Thorne isn't worth a warm bed." The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The sterile hospital room had become a courtroom, and the verdict was being delivered by the king of country himself. Elias squeezed Norma's hand, his eyes wet with tears. He had thought he would die invisible. Now the whole world was watching over him. But the fight wasn't over. Vance was cornered, and cornered animals bite. He straightened his jacket, his eyes narrowing with spite. He realized he was finished, but he wanted to draw blood before he fell. "You think you can buy your way out of everything straight?" Vance sneered, forgetting the camera, or perhaps past the point of caring. You think, because you can sing a song, you understand the real world. This hospital is bankrupt. We are broke. If I don't move him, we can't pay the nurses next week. You want to be the hero? Fine, but don't act like I'm the villain for trying to keep the lights on. It was a desperate deflection, but it held a kernel of truth that stung. The rural healthcare crisis was real, but George wasn't interested in excuses. He was interested in action. "You're right," George said calmly to the camera and to Vance. "The system is broken, but we don't fix it by throwing out the people we're supposed to save." George reached into his inside jacket pocket. He pulled out a checkbook. It was an old-fashioned leather-bound checkbook, the kind a rancher carries to cattle auctions. He walked over to the bedside table, pushing aside the medicine cups. He uncapped a pen. "You said 40,000 covers his care," George asked, not looking up as he began to write. "That's the past due," Vance stammered, watching the pen move. "The projected costs for hospice care are—" "Double it," George said. He tore the check out with a crisp ripping sound. He held it up. 80,000, that covers Elias. Now, he looked at Sarah, the nurse. "How much to keep this wing open? To fix the heater? To make sure nobody else gets evicted this winter?" Sarah gasped, doing mental math. "Mr. Straight up, I don't know. 100,000? Maybe more?" George looked back at the checkbook. He turned to a fresh page. He wrote quickly, his hand steady. He filled in the numbers. He signed his name with the same flourish that had autographed 1 million albums. He tore the second check out. $1 million, George said quietly, holding the slip of paper out to Sarah, not Vance. "For the hospital, for the nurses, for the patients." He turned the camera back to his face. "Folks, I just bought a hospital wing, and I'm naming it the Elias Thorne Center for Hope. But there's a condition." He turned the lens to Vance one last time. "Mr. Vance here has to resign, effective immediately." The silence that followed George Strait's ultimatum was heavier than the blizzard burying the Texas panhandle outside. The check for $1 million sat in the air, held between George's weathered fingers like a flag of truce that was also a declaration of victory. The camera on the smartphone was still rolling, broadcasting the standoff to a world that was suddenly holding its collective breath. Mr. Vance looked at the check. He looked at the zeros. He looked at the face of Sarah, the nurse, whose expression had shifted from fear to a fierce, protective hope. Then he looked at the phone screen where the comment section was scrolling so fast it was a blur of outrage and support for the cowboy in the canvas jacket. Vance was a man of numbers, and he knew when the math didn't add up. He had lost the room. He had lost the narrative. And if he didn't walk away now, he would lose whatever shred of professional reputation he had left. Vance straightened his tie one last time, a reflex of a man trying to armor himself against humiliation. He didn't say a word. There was no apology, no moment of redemption for him. He simply turned on his heel, his expensive shoes squeaking on the linoleum, and walked toward the door. The two security guards who had been ready to evict a dying man 10 minutes ago stepped aside. They didn't salute him. They didn't nod. One of them actually held the door open with a look of undisguised relief. Vance stepped out into the hallway, and the door clicked shut behind him, sealing the bad energy out, leaving the room to the people who actually possessed a heart. George lowered the phone, ending the live stream. He didn't check the views. He didn't look for validation. He slid the phone back into his pocket and turned to Sarah. He handed her the check. "Make sure the heater gets fixed first," George said, his voice soft again, the thunder gone. "And make sure Elias gets the best pillow in the building." Sarah took the slip of paper, her hands trembling. She looked like she wanted to hug him, but she maintained her professional distance, nodding through tears. "Thank you, Mr. Straight. We won't let you down, I promise." "I know you won't," George said. "Now, if you don't mind, could you give us a minute? Me and Mr. Thorne have some catching up to do." Sarah nodded, signaling the guards to follow her. They left the room, closing the door gently. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The tension of the battle evaporated, replaced by a sacred, solemn intimacy. It was just George, Norma, and Elias now. The celebrity was gone. The billionaire was gone. It was just two men connected by a patch of dirt and a history of sacrifice. George pulled a metal chair close to the bed. The adrenaline was fading, and he felt the weight of the night settle on his shoulders. He took his hat off again, placing it on his knee. He looked at Elias. The old man was weaker now, the excitement of the confrontation having drained his last reserves of energy. But his eyes were clear. The milky haze seemed to have lifted, revealing a sharp, piercing blue that reminded George of the winter sky. "Ah, you didn't have to do that, son," Elias whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "That was a lot of money for an old horse that's ready for the glue factory." George smiled a sad, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "It wasn't for you, Elias, it was for the debt. My daddy, he taught me that a man who doesn't pay his debts isn't a man at all. I've been living on interest my whole life. It was time to pay the principal." Elias chuckled, a sound that turned into a wheeze. Norma reached out and adjusted his blanket, tucking him in with the tenderness of a mother. "You look just like him," Elias said, looking at George. "You got John's stubbornness. I saw it when you stood up to that suit. John would have thrown him through the window, though." George laughed softly. "Yeah, he probably would have. I've mellowed out in my old age." The wind howled outside, rattling the window pane, but inside it felt warm, safe. Elias turned his head slightly, looking at the guitar case standing in the corner of the room, a prop George had brought for the other patients, but hadn't opened yet. "You play it?" Elias asked, nodding toward the case. "Or is it just for show?" George stood up and walked to the corner. He unlatched the case, the snap sounding loud in the quiet room. He lifted out his acoustic guitar, the wood worn smooth from decades of use. "I play a little," George quipped, the understatement of the century. He sat back down, crossing his legs and resting the guitar on his thigh. He didn't strum a loud chord. He just picked a few notes, a simple, gentle melody that sounded like rain on a tin roof. It was a song he hadn't played in years, an old cowboy ballad that his father used to hum while fixing fences. "This one's for the ridge," George said softly, "for the rocky ground you kept so we could have the river." He began to sing. His voice was not the booming voice of the stadium shows. It was a whisper, a lullaby. He sang about the open range, about the smell of sagebrush after a storm, about the way the sun hits the canyon walls at dusk. It was a song about going home. Elias closed his eyes. His breathing slowed. The lines of pain on his face began to smooth out, relaxing into a mask of peace. He wasn't in a cold hospital room anymore. In his mind, he was back on his horse, young and strong, riding the fence line of the land he loved. He was seeing the Texas he remembered, the Texas that was wild and free. Norma held Elias's left hand. George kept playing his right hand, dancing over the fretboard. The monitor's beep became rhythmic, a metronome for the song. And then, slowly, the rhythm changed. The spaces between the beeps grew longer. The chest of the old cowboy rose and fell with less depth. George didn't stop playing. He knew what was happening. He had seen it before. Death wasn't crashing into the room. It was slipping in quietly to take a tired traveler home. George segued into "The Cowboy Rides Away." He sang the final verse, his voice cracking just a little with emotion. "And my heart is sinking like the setting sun, setting on the things I wish I'd done." As the final note faded into the air, hanging suspended like a prayer, Elias Thorne let out a long, slow breath. His hand went limp in Norma's grip. The monitor let out a singular long tone, a flat line that sounded less like an alarm and more like a horizon line stretching out forever. George placed his hand over the guitar strings, silencing the vibration. He didn't call the nurse immediately. He sat there for a moment in the presence of the departed, honoring the transition. He looked at the face of the man who had saved his family. Elias looked at peace. He looked like a king who had finally laid down his crown. "Thank you," George whispered into the silence. "Rest easy, partner. We got the watch from here." The Texas sun was setting again, painting the sky in the same bruised purples and burnt oranges, but the scene on the ground was different. The Dusty Creek Memorial Hospital no longer looked like a condemned building. The brick had been power washed, the parking lot repaved. The sign out front was new, illuminated by crisp LED lights. Beneath the hospital name, a new plaque had been installed, bronze and shining. The Elias Thorne Wing, dedicated to the spirit of generosity and the cowboy code. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of pine needles and cinnamon. It was Christmas Eve again, but the atmosphere was festive, not desperate. The nurse's station was decorated with new garland, and there was a real tree in the lobby touching the ceiling. Sarah, now the head administrator, walked through the halls with a clipboard that held patient charts, not eviction notices. She wore a pin on her lapel, a small silver cowboy hat. In room 304, a young woman sat by the bed of her grandmother reading a book. The room was refurbished with comfortable chairs and state-of-the-art equipment. It was a place of healing, not warehousing. Miles away on the straight ranch, George sat on his porch. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of a coming winter, but the fire in the outdoor pit was roaring. He held a glass of iced tea, the ice clinking softly. On the table next to him sat the old cigar box. He had framed the deed and the photo, hanging them in his study, next to his gold records and industry awards. But he liked to bring the box out sometimes, just to touch the wood, to remember the texture of sacrifice. Norma walked out onto the porch, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. She sat next to him, resting her head on his shoulder. They watched the sun dip below the horizon, the light catching the dust motes in the air, turning them into gold dust. "Do you think he knows?" Norma asked softly, looking out over the land, the 600 acres of river-bottom soil that was lush and fertile even in winter. George took a sip of his tea. He thought about the hospital wing. He thought about the fund they had set up, which now helped struggling ranchers pay their medical bills. He thought about the thousands of letters he had received from people who had been inspired to help their own neighbors because of that live stream. "I think he knew before he left," George said. "He knew that the seed he planted 60 years ago finally bloomed." He reached into the cigar box and pulled out a single, unsmoked cigar that had been at the bottom, dried out and brittle. He didn't light it. He just rolled it between his fingers. "You know," George said, his voice thoughtful, "people call me the king of country. It's a nice title. But Elias, he was the real royalty. He didn't need a crown. He just needed a patch of dirt and a promise." George stood up, walking to the edge of the porch. He looked out at the vast expanse of Texas darkness that was stretching out before him. The stars were coming out one by one, bright and sharp in the clear air. He picked out a star that seemed to shine a little brighter than the rest, hanging right over the ridge where Elias used to live. George tipped his hat to the star. It was a small gesture unseen by the world, but massive in its meaning. "Merry Christmas, Elias," he whispered. He turned back to Norma and the warmth of his home. The wind chimes sang their melody, a song of peace and continuity. The world was complicated and often cruel, but as long as there were people willing to remember the debts of the past and honor the strangers who carried them, there was hope. The cowboy had ridden away, but the trail he left behind would guide them for generations to come. George closed the cigar box gently, the sound of the lid snapping shut echoing like a final, satisfied heartbeat.